In the early 20th century, the Balkan Peninsula was a powder keg of ambition, identity, and history. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had held sway over the region, its influence stretching across mountains, rivers, and cities filled with diverse peoples and cultures. Yet, as the empire weakened, centuries-old tensions that had simmered beneath the surface began to erupt. Nationalist movements gained momentum as Serbs, Bulgarians, Greeks, Montenegrins, and Romanians sought to reclaim lands they believed rightfully belonged to them, inspired by a shared sense of history, culture, and destiny. Among the most contested regions were Macedonia, Thrace, Kosovo, and the Adriatic coast areas rich not only in resources but in symbolic significance. Local populations were a patchwork of religions, languages, and traditions, making every claim a complex puzzle of overlapping identities. It was a time when alliances shifted quickly, loyalties were tested, and every city and fortress could become a stage for history-defining battles. The weakening Ottoman grip, combined with these nationalist aspirations, set the stage for two successive wars that would not only redraw borders but also leave an indelible mark on the people who lived through them. Soldiers marched to the front with hope and fear, families faced imaginable losses, and the future of an entire region hung in the balance. As we explore the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, we will uncover stories of courage, strategy, and tragedy, stories that shaped the modern map of Europe and foreshadowed even greater conflicts to come. Dive into the epic saga of the Balkan Peninsula, where empires faltered, nations emerged, and history was written in blood and ambition. If you enjoy uncovering hidden chapters of history and want to follow these remarkable stories, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the past. As the Balkan Peninsula simmered with unrest, the ambitions of its emerging nations did not exist in a vacuum. Beyond the mountains and rivers, far-reaching capitals watched with a mixture of calculation and apprehension, each seeking to secure its own influence while preventing rivals from gaining an upper hand. Austria-Hungary, weary of the growing power of Serbia and its potential to inspire unrest among Slavic populations within the dual monarchy, moved decisively to assert control over contested territories, most notably annexing Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908. This action, intended to stabilize their own borders, instead sent shockwaves through the region, igniting nationalist passions and deepening the mistrust between neighbors. Russia, meanwhile, saw in the Balkans both an opportunity and a responsibility. Viewing itself as the protector of Orthodox Slavs and the champion of nations striving to shake off Ottoman domination, Moscow encouraged alliances and military preparations, balancing its desire for influence against the peril of provoking other powers into open confrontation. For the Russian leadership, the stakes were as much about prestige and strategic access to the Turkish Straits as they were about ideological solidarity, and their cautious yet assertive diplomacy added a layer of tension to an already volatile mix. Britain and France, concerned primarily with maintaining the broader European balance and safeguarding trade routes, watched the unfolding turmoil from a distance, ready to intervene diplomatically or militarily if the collapse of Ottoman control threatened their strategic interests. In a continent still haunted by the memory of previous wars, the great powers' interventions were often contradictory, sending mixed signals that left Balkan leaders uncertain and increasingly desperate to act before opportunity slipped away. Their proclamations of stability and protection frequently masked calculations that prioritized national advantage over regional justice, creating a climate in which promises of support or restraint were viewed with suspicion, and any misstep could ignite a chain reaction of conflict. Within this environment, the Balkan states navigated a perilous path, negotiating alliances with each other while remaining acutely aware of how their moves would be perceived by Vienna. Petersburg, London, and Paris. The Balkan League itself was a product of both local ambition and international diplomacy. Its formation encouraged by Russia, yet constantly under the shadow of competing interests from the other powers, even as the League planned its campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. Leaders had to consider not only the capabilities of their own armies, but also the responses of foreign states whose fleets, funds, and political support could tip the scales at a moment's notice. Every border dispute, every territorial claim, and every military maneuver carried consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield. What might have been a local contest for land and resources became entangled in a complex web of international rivalry, where Austria-Hungary's fears of Slavic unity, Russia's protective ambitions, Britain's insistence on balance, and the cautious interference of other European capitals combined to make the region a tinderbox. Ordinary civilians, unaware of treaties and diplomatic assurances, bore the brunt of this geopolitical chess game. Experiencing displacement, violence, and uncertainty as armies advanced and retreated under the direction of leaders whose calculations often ignored human cost. In this high-stakes environment, the Balkan Wars became not merely a struggle between new nations and a waning empire, but a stage where the ambitions and anxieties of Europe's great powers were projected onto a region whose peoples had long been shaped by conquest and coexistence. The delicate balance of diplomacy and power in the Balkans was constantly tested, revealing how deeply interconnected local and international affairs had become, and how the interventions of distant capitals could inflame the passions, fears, and resentments of those living on the front lines of history. The intricate interplay of ambition, loyalty, and fear set the tone for a conflict that would leave lasting scars on both the region and the wider continent, foreshadowing the even greater upheavals to come. By the autumn of 1912, the simmering tensions and overlapping ambitions of the Balkan states coalesced into a formidable alliance, known as the Balkan League, a coalition of Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, brought together with the careful encouragement of Russia, which sought to assert influence over the region while supporting the aspirations of fellow Slavic and Orthodox nations. The League's leaders, acutely aware of the faltering Ottoman grip on Europe, recognized a rare opportunity to expand their territories, reclaim lands they believed were historically and culturally theirs, and secure strategic advantages that had long been denied by centuries of Ottoman rule. Yet, even as they united against a common enemy, the shadows of rivalry and mistrust lingered, for the spoils of victory territories in Macedonia, Thrace, and the Adriatic coast remained points of contention, and no clear plan had been agreed upon for dividing the lands once the Ottomans were defeated. As the League prepared for war, the atmosphere was charged with both hope and apprehension. Armies were mobilized, young men left their homes, and families watched with pride and trepidation, knowing that the coming campaign would determine not only borders but the fate of generations. Each state brought its own motivations and strategies to the alliance. Serbia sought to strengthen its position in Macedonia and secure access to the Adriatic. Bulgaria was determined to claim Thrace and portions of Macedonia. Greece focused on strategic ports and control over Salonika, while Montenegro pressed its historical claims along the Adriatic, aiming to expand its influence in the north. These overlapping claims, though temporarily set aside in the name of a united front, foreshadowed the bitter disputes that would emerge once the common enemy was pushed back. The League's coordination was as much a diplomatic endeavor as a military one, with each government negotiating constantly, aware of both the ambitions of its partners and the watchful eyes of the great powers. Russia's role was pivotal, providing assurances, advice, and encouragement while subtly steering the League's actions to align with its strategic vision for the Balkans. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary, Britain, and other European powers observed warily, understanding that a victorious Balkan coalition could unsettle the fragile balance of power in the region and threaten their own interests, particularly along the Adriatic and in the Ottoman Straits. Every move had to be carefully calculated, as a premature offensive or unilateral claim could spark conflict not just among the Balkan states but with the larger empires whose influence stretched across the continent. When hostilities finally erupted, the League moved swiftly against the Ottoman Empire, whose forces were weakened by prior defeats in Libya and internal unrest. The initial campaigns were marked by rapid advances, sieges of key fortresses, and dramatic victories that bolstered morale and demonstrated the League's effectiveness as a coordinated force. Yet even amidst triumph, the underlying tensions between allies simmered beneath the surface, as officers and politicians began to anticipate the moment when the Ottoman territories would be divided and questions of sovereignty, access, and influence would come to the forefront. The victories on the battlefield only amplified the urgency of these disputes, and the absence of a detailed post-war agreement meant that the League's unity was inherently fragile, dependent on continued coordination and mutual restraint even as national ambitions tugged in different directions. In this complex web of alliances and ambitions, the formation of the Balkan League represented both the promise of liberation from centuries of Ottoman control and the seeds of future conflict among the victors themselves. It was a moment when history hung in the balance, illustrating how shared goals could temporarily unite rivals, how diplomacy and strategy intertwined with nationalism, and how the outcomes of a single war could ripple across borders, shaping the fates of nations and the lives of ordinary people caught in the crossfire. The story of the Balkan League in 1912 stands as a testament to the precarious nature of alliances built on opportunity, ambition, and the intricate dance of power in a region long defined by its complexity and diversity. As autumn of 1912 deepened, the Balkan League, forged in the fires of shared ambition and guided by the strategic influence of Russia, turned its focus on the Ottoman Empire, which, despite its vast history and former power, was now beleaguered by years of territorial losses, internal strife, and waning military capacity. The League's armies, though composed largely of peasant conscripts, were driven by nationalist fervor and a desire to reclaim lands long under Ottoman control, and they moved with a coordinated urgency that reflected both careful planning and opportunistic boldness. The first major thrust was directed toward the fortress city of Edirne, an ancient stronghold whose walls had witnessed centuries of conflict. Bulgarian forces, aware of the symbolic and strategic importance of the city, surrounded it with determination, prepared to invest not just soldiers, but the collective will of a nation that saw its liberation from Ottoman dominance as a historical imperative. The siege was relentless, and though casualties mounted on both sides, the Ottomans found themselves increasingly outmatched, their attempts at counter-offensives hampered by logistical failures, poorly trained reserve units, and the absence of key officers who were deployed elsewhere in Libya or engaged in quelling domestic unrest. While the Bulgarians pressed their advantage in Thrace, Serbian forces pushed into Macedonia, where the Battle of Kumanovo became a defining moment in the campaign. Despite the Ottomans outnumbering the Serbs in some areas, their fragmented command, muddy and rain-sodden terrain, and lack of cohesive artillery support rendered them vulnerable to the disciplined Serbian advance. Trenches and foxholes became the grim theater of modern combat, where machine guns and artillery dictated the pace and human cost of victory. And the Serbian artillery, adapting quickly to battlefield conditions, eventually broke Ottoman resistance. The streets and fields bore witness to the suffering and bravery of ordinary soldiers, and the aftermath left towns crowded with wounded, dead, and displaced civilians, a vivid reminder of the human price of territorial ambition. In the south, the Greek army moved swiftly through Thessaly and Macedonia, prioritizing the strategic port of Salonika, a prize that symbolized both economic advantage and access to the sea. The Greek navy, a well-organized force of cruisers and destroyers, secured control of the Aegean, effectively cutting off any hope for Ottoman reinforcements and supply lines, isolating the defenders and creating a tactical environment in which the League could operate with relative freedom. Greek forces encountered resistance at mountain passes like Sarantoporos and fortified towns such as Yanitsa. But their persistence, combined with the demoralized state of the Ottoman troops, enabled them to advance steadily, culminating in the encirclement and surrender of Salonika, a city whose fall marked a critical blow to Ottoman hopes of retaining dominance in Europe. Meanwhile, the Ottoman command, hampered by a mixture of bureaucratic indecision, contested authority between civilian and military leaders, and an exhausted army, struggled to mount effective defenses. Mustafa Kemal, serving as an officer during these campaigns, observed firsthand the consequences of disorganized strategy and the devastating effect of low morale on troops. Experiences that would shape his understanding of military leadership in the years to come. The rapid succession of defeats, compounded by the inability to mobilize reinforcements due to Greek naval supremacy, underscored the empire's vulnerability and the League's growing momentum. Throughout Thrace, Macedonia, and the approaches to Constantinople, the local populations witnessed sweeping changes. As territories shifted hands, fortresses fell, and the once dominant Ottoman presence receded under the pressure of coordinated League advances, leaving behind a complex patchwork of liberated towns, displaced civilians, and the first clear signs that the Balkans' centuries-old balance of power had irrevocably changed. In this sweeping campaign, the League's victories were not simply the result of numerical superiority. They reflected strategic coordination, decisive use of naval power, and exploitation of Ottoman weaknesses in logistics, leadership, and morale. The battles of Edirne, Kumanovo, and Salonika demonstrated the potency of a united coalition against a historically entrenched but declining power, setting the stage for the final phases of the First Balkan War and illuminating the human costs. Political calculations and shifting alliances that defined the Balkans at the dawn of the 20th century. As the Balkan League's armies swept through Ottoman territories, the human cost of the war became tragically apparent, not only in the theaters of battle but in the villages, towns, and cities that lay behind the front lines, where civilians bore the brunt of a conflict driven by nationalist ambition and centuries-old grievances. In Thrace, Macedonia, and the approaches to Constantinople, the advance of Bulgarian, Serbian, Greek, and Montenegrin forces brought both liberation and terror, depending on one's perspective. Christian populations, long under Ottoman rule, often greeted the arrival of the League's troops with relief and hope, believing that centuries of foreign dominance were finally coming to an end. Yet the reality of occupation and war quickly turned these hopes into a mix of fear and uncertainty. Irregular militias and local volunteers, motivated by loyalty to their emerging nations or by long-standing personal grievances, blurred the line between combatant and civilian, carrying out acts of revenge or seizure of property that intensified the chaos. Homes were burned, fields trampled, and villages emptied as families fled advancing armies, their exodus adding to the swelling numbers of refugees streaming toward urban centers still under Ottoman control. In Macedonia, Serbian troops' victories at Kumanovo and subsequent advances triggered waves of panic among Muslim communities, who feared retribution for prior Ottoman policies or simply the violence that inevitably accompanied military conquest. Trains that carried captured soldiers, wounded, and the dead clogged stations, creating grim scenes of human suffering, while the displaced and starving struggled to find food, shelter, and safety. Bulgarian advances in Thrace had a similar effect, as captured towns experienced summary executions of former Ottoman officials and local landowners, and civilians were caught in the crossfire or forced into flight. The testimony of those who lived through these moments captures the complexity of the human experience in war. Elation and relief for some mingled with grief, fear, and the shock of sudden displacement for others. In Salonika, the fall of the city to Greek forces left an uneasy joint presence of Bulgarian and Greek soldiers, while civilians struggled to navigate the shifting control of their homes and livelihoods, unsure who would govern them and under what laws. Constantinople, the imperial capital, faced its own crisis as tens of thousands of refugees poured in from across the Balkans, overwhelming the city's capacity to house, feed, and care for them. Mosques, including the iconic Blue Mosque, were converted into makeshift hospitals to treat the sick and dying, while cholera outbreaks, famine, and unsanitary conditions ravaged both refugees and the city's existing population. British and other European diplomats, alarmed by the scale of suffering and fearing reprisals against Christians, dispatched warships to the Bosporus, seeking to protect vulnerable communities and maintain some semblance of order amidst the turmoil. In countless towns, the cycle of violence fed upon itself. Christian populations, emboldened or fearful, sometimes turned against their Muslim neighbors, while Muslim communities, displaced and desperate, faced hunger, disease, and the loss of property, fueling long-lasting resentment that would shape future conflicts. The Balkan Wars thus left behind not only a redrawn map but a human landscape marked by suffering and dislocation. Massacres, expulsions, and famine created waves of refugees whose experiences were recorded in diaries, letters, and eyewitness accounts that speak of fear, grief, and the collapse of social structures. Villages emptied, cities overcrowded, and the social fabric of the Balkans was stretched to its limits. Both Christian and Muslim communities endured trauma and loss, and the demographic upheavals planted the seeds for enduring tension and mistrust. Even as new nations emerged and the Ottoman Empire's European presence receded, the conflict revealed the brutal realities of nationalist ambition, when combined with the vulnerabilities of a declining empire, demonstrating that military victories on the battlefield were inseparable from the human suffering left in their wake, shaping the Balkans for decades to come and leaving a profound imprint on the collective memory of the region. By the spring of 1913, the Ottoman Empire's centuries-long dominion over Europe had effectively collapsed, leaving behind a patchwork of territories claimed by the victorious Balkan League. Yet the triumph was far from neat or peaceful. The Treaty of London, signed in late May, formalized the end of the First Balkan War and dramatically reshaped the map. Most of Ottoman Europe was ceded to the League, while the Principality of Albania emerged as an independent state. Proclaimed on November 28, 1912, with the support of Austria-Hungary and Italy, who sought to prevent Serbia from controlling the Adriatic coast. Yet, independence did not bring immediate stability, as the newly formed nation found itself encircled by ambitious neighbors eager to extend influence over its lands. Borders were drawn hastily, often ignoring the complex ethnic, religious, and historical realities on the ground, which left Albania vulnerable to external pressure and internal unrest. The competing ambitions of Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, and Bulgaria created a tense environment in which diplomacy and military maneuvers went hand in hand, each side seeking to consolidate its gains from the war before rivals could assert their claims. The post-war period revealed the fragile cohesion of the Balkan League itself. Despite their joint victory over the Ottoman forces, disagreements over territorial division quickly emerged. Serbia and Bulgaria clashed over Macedonia, a region rich in strategic and symbolic value, while Greece and Bulgaria disputed the spoils of Salonika, a city that had become a critical hub for commerce. Administration and military strategy. Bulgaria, which had borne the brunt of the fighting in Thrace and captured key fortresses such as Edirne, felt its sacrifices had not been fully rewarded, especially as Russian mediation proved insufficient to satisfy all parties. Tensions simmered as exhausted armies returned home. Soldiers confronted the realities of devastated villages, displaced populations, and lingering epidemics, and governments struggled to assert control over both their militaries and their territories. The delicate balance of power, already precarious before the war, was now more volatile than ever, with nationalist fervor, historical grievances, and great power interests intersecting to create an unstable regional order. Albania, despite its recognition as a sovereign state, became a focal point of contestation. The new principality faced incursions, pressure, and influence from surrounding powers eager to shape its borders to their advantage. While internally, political cohesion was fragile, complicated by competing clans and limited administrative experience. The League's members, meanwhile, were already eyeing further expansion, driven by unresolved claims and ambitions left over from the Ottoman collapse. Serbia sought to secure Macedonia and access to the Adriatic. Bulgaria aimed to assert dominance over Thrace and portions of Macedonia. Greece prioritized strategic ports and access to Salonika, and Montenegro looked to consolidate its gains around northern Albanian territories. These overlapping claims ensured that even after formal peace, the region remained a tinderbox of potential conflict, with military leaders and political elites maneuvering to secure national interests before rivals could act. The consequences of these unresolved disputes extended beyond mere territorial adjustments. Populations uprooted by war remained displaced. Towns and villages struggled to rebuild after months of fighting, and both Christian and Muslim communities endured the trauma of massacres, famine, and forced migration. Refugee flows strained the resources of newly independent or newly expanded states, while memories of atrocities and injustices fanned nationalist sentiment across the Balkans. In this charged environment, alliances were fragile, and mistrust between neighbors deepened. The Balkan Wars had delivered military victories, independence for Albania, and the retreat of Ottoman authority from Europe. Yet the unresolved tensions, overlapping claims, and human suffering left behind created the conditions for renewed conflict. By May 1913, the region stood at a precarious crossroads, celebrating its victories while simultaneously bracing for the inevitable disputes that would soon ignite the Second Balkan War and further shape the course of European history, demonstrating that triumphs in battle were inseparable from the complexities of politics, diplomacy, and the human cost of war. The fragile peace that followed the First Balkan War quickly unraveled as Bulgaria, bitter over the distribution of territories it believed rightfully belonged to it, launched a surprise attack against its former allies, Serbia and Greece, igniting the Second Balkan War in June 1913. The Bulgarian leadership, convinced that their sacrifices in Thracian victories over Ottoman forces had not been properly rewarded, sought to assert control over Macedonia and Salonika, believing that decisive military action could force a resolution in their favor. However, the offensive was poorly coordinated, with communication breakdowns and exhausted troops undermining its effectiveness. And the Serbian and Greek armies quickly organized to repel the assault, turning Bulgaria's calculated gamble into a precarious fight for survival. The rapid escalation of hostilities drew in neighboring states, as Romania, seizing an opportunity to press claims on southern Dobroja, entered the conflict with 250,000 troops advancing toward Sofia, exposing Bulgaria to a multi-front struggle that further strained its depleted military and logistical capacity. The combination of Romanian advance, Greek and Serbian resistance, and internal political uncertainty created a sense of urgency and desperation within Sofia, leading to the eventual resignation of the pro-Russian government and the installation of a pro-German cabinet under Vasil Radoslavov, though the change in leadership could do little to reverse the military tide. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, having recovered somewhat from the devastation of the First Balkan War, observed the unfolding chaos with renewed purpose, and in July 1913, Ottoman forces crossed the Catalca line to reclaim eastern Thrace, capitalizing on Bulgaria's distraction. Despite their earlier defeats, the Ottomans demonstrated the resilience of their forces, reclaiming fortresses and territory with relatively minimal resistance as Bulgarian units were thinly stretched and unable to mount a significant defense. This resurgence allowed the empire to regain a measure of strategic leverage, particularly as the Balkan League members found themselves embroiled in conflict with one another rather than focusing on Ottoman lands. The human cost of these campaigns was immense, with refugees fleeing advancing armies, cholera and disease devastating both soldiers and civilians, and widespread destruction leaving villages in ruins. Bulgarian civilians, in particular, bore the brunt of the conflict, displaced by Romanian forces and targeted by Greek and Serbian troops, while the Ottoman civilian population in eastern Thrace faced renewed uncertainty and hardship. Diplomatic efforts struggled to keep pace with the rapidly shifting battlefield, and by August and September 1913, peace treaties were finally signed, bringing formal closure to the Second Balkan War but at a steep cost to Bulgaria. Southern Dobroja was ceded to Romania, Macedonia was divided between Serbia and Greece, and the Ottomans consolidated control over eastern Thrace, reversing some of Bulgaria's earlier gains. The treaties reflected the influence of the great powers, whose strategic interests shaped the resolution, ensuring that no single Balkan state could dominate the region entirely. Bulgaria's dissatisfaction and sense of betrayal during these negotiations sowed seeds of long-term resentment, altering its alliances and political orientation toward Germany and Austria-Hungary, while Serbia and Greece solidified territorial gains that would fuel future ambitions. The Second Balkan War thus reshaped the map once again, illustrating the volatile interplay of military action, national ambition, and diplomatic maneuvering, and setting the stage for further conflict that would eventually erupt across Europe in 1914, demonstrating that even victorious nations could emerge from war weakened and vulnerable to both external threats and internal discord. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 left a scarred and transformed region in their wake, forever altering the political, social, and human landscape of Southeast Europe. The fighting had been intense and relentless, claiming the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers from all sides, while civilians endured massacres, forced expulsions, famine, and waves of refugees streaming from villages and cities caught in the crossfire. Entire communities were uprooted, mosques, churches, and homes destroyed, and centuries-old patterns of coexistence shattered, leaving bitterness and mistrust among neighbors who had once lived side by side. The Ottoman Empire, already weakened by decades of decline, lost almost all of its European territories, reduced to a fragile enclave near Constantinople, while Albania emerged as a new state, though its borders remained contested by its ambitious neighbors. Bulgaria, dissatisfied with the division of spoils after the First Balkan War, found itself overextended and politically isolated during the Second Balkan War, facing attacks from Serbia, Greece, Romania, and even the resurgent Ottomans, ultimately losing territory it had fought hard to claim. Serbia and Greece, while victorious, were forced to navigate the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and claims that emerged from the conflicts, while Romania and Austria-Hungary acted decisively to protect their interests, further complicating regional dynamics. These wars did more than redraw maps, they created a volatile environment in which grievances, ambitions, and mistrust fermented into long-term instability. Bulgaria's resentment at perceived betrayals and lost territories pushed it closer to Germany and Austria-Hungary, while Serbia's rise as a regional power intensified Austro-Hungarian fears of encirclement and Slavic nationalism. Russia, Serbia's protector, found its role in the Balkans more critical than ever. feeling pressure to support its ally against Austria-Hungary, while the major European powers watched anxiously, aware that any spark could ignite a larger conflict. The networks of alliances and antagonisms forged during the Balkan Wars, the bitterness left in the wake of territorial disputes, and the unresolved questions of sovereignty and national identity created a powder keg, one that would soon explode with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, leading directly to the outbreak of World War. As we look back, the Balkan Wars remind us of how local conflicts can ripple outward, shaping the destinies of nations and altering the course of global history. They serve as a stark lesson in the human cost of nationalism and the fragility of peace when ambition, revenge, and external interference collide. The lives lost, the communities destroyed, and the enduring grievances formed during these two wars left a legacy that reverberated across Europe and beyond, ultimately contributing to the catastrophe of the Great War. Thank you for joining us on this journey into history. And if you found this exploration insightful, do not forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that bring the past to life and help us understand the forces that have shaped our world.